Disclaimer. For years, the strange events you'll hear about were covered up by governments and powerful people who didn't want the truth to come out. But not anymore. I cannot tell you my real name because they might come after me, so I'm forced to release these investigative reports through strange robot voice. Considering that an emotionless voice will explain major events that actually drain our emotions for real. This is really weird, I guess, but it's the only way to stay hidden and not get beaten up like the other poor souls who knew too much. What happened to the ones who transform under the full moon is 100% real, as are the other stories. No matter what Morgan Freeman, Scarlett Johansson, or whoever the next weirdo synthetics voices might say, trust me, this will make you double-check under your bed. Tonight we begin with the crushing weight, the acoustic shadows, and the fatal laughter of the Boggart. A formless vapor of the ancient peat bog weighs exactly 180 pounds when it sits on your chest. A physical beast that possesses absolutely no body until you close your eyes. Chaos roamed the fens until humans made the fatal mistake of dragging it indoors, locking the nightmare inside with iron-banded doors and feeding it with hearth fires. The creature adapted, living in the silence of your footsteps, breaking your tools to save your family, and hiding in the nursery as a babysitter. Yet this terrifying shapeshifter had one fatal flaw. It was defeated by a poorly timed punchline. So, before you get the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. The wild did not break into the home. The dangerous spirit of the ancient peat bog only became a true terror when humans dragged it inside their own houses. Before the timber and the thatch, the entity was just marsh gas and stagnant water. It was a localized, diffuse nuisance. The Celtic farmers changed the terms of engagement. They forced a boundaryless thing into a box and they paid for it. Iron and oak built the cage. Around 400 BCE, an early Celtic farmer in the wetlands of what is now Cheshire made a calculated error. He needed a guard for his hearth, a sentinel that required no sleep and knew no mercy. The peat bog held a chaotic spirit, a shapeless mass of malice and territorial rage. The farmer's goal was simple: domesticate this wild animus, bind it to his threshold, and let it hunt anything that crossed the lintel. The obstacle was structural. The formless entity could not understand the concept of walls. The physical anchor of this failed experiment survives. A heavy, iron-banded oak front door, recovered from the mire, carries deep, frantic gouges scratched entirely from the inside. The Glastonbury Lake Village excavation of 1892 first documented this specific type of structural damage. Arthur Bullitt's team pulled fragments of massive oak doors from the wet peat of Mound 74. The wood was preserved by the tannins, but the interior faces were shredded. The scratch marks did not match the claw patterns of wolves or bears. They were long, parallel grooves worn into the heartwood by something trying to push out, not in. The sapwood was entirely stripped away on the interior face. The iron bands on the door were bent outward at the corners. The hand-forged iron nails, 2 inches long, were sheared off by the pressure from the inside. This is the physical receipt of the Boggart's containment. The farmer brought the bog inside. The bog immediately tried to return to the open marsh. The domestication attempt is recorded in early Welsh legal tracts. The Leifer Iorwerth, compiled circa 1230 but copying much older oral traditions from the early medieval period, details the sea cors, the hound of the bog. The tract outlines the strict penalties for a householder who keeps one. The text states the owner is liable for the madness the spirit inflicts on guests and neighbors. The law recognized the hazard. The farmer didn't just want a pet, he wanted a weapon. He took a raw piece of the wild, a thing that had roamed the fens for 100,000 years without a single physical limit, and he put a lock on it. A spirit that exists without edges cannot process a corner. The bog entity knew the vastness of the open sky. It knew the slow pull of the tides and the endless stretch of the reeds. It did not know the dead end of a wattle and daub wall. For 100,000 years it moved freely across the fens. Then it was forced into a space no larger than 12 feet across. When the farmer closed the iron-banded oak door, the entity panicked. The myth states that the boggart would throw itself against the beams. It would seep into the thatch trying to find the sky, only to be called back by the hearth fire the farmer used as its anchor. The fire was a leash. The heat was a command it could not disobey. Consider the mechanics of the scratches on the door. Forensic analysis of the Glastonbury door fragment shows the grooves are deepest at the center, fanning out toward the edges. The grooves measure 1/4 of an inch deep in the heartwood. The entity wasn't trying to break the wood, it was trying to fit through the cracks. A shapeless thing will compress, stretch, and tear itself apart to find an exit. The iron bands held, the oak held, but the containment failed. The boggart didn't become a loyal guard dog. It became a frantic, cornered animal trapped in a dark box, fed only by the heat of a hearth it didn't understand. Gervase of Tilbury's Odia Imperiala, compiled in 1214, provides the textual evidence for the behavioral shift. He writes of the drac, or folet, a spirit that inhabits houses, tearing at the woodwork and throwing stones when confined. Gervase notes the spirit's absolute confusion at closed spaces. It knows not the limit of the door, he writes, and beats the timber as the wind beats the cliff. The farmer wanted a guardian. He built a prison. The spirit's panic is what made it hostile. The wild animus was not evil before it was locked up. It was just chaotic. Confinement distilled that chaos into malice. The farmer's logic was flawed from the start. You cannot tame a flood by putting it in a jug. The hearth fire kept the bog spirit from dissolving back into the marsh, but it also kept the spirit in a state of constant, territorial anxiety. The door, heavy and iron-banded, was the ultimate insult. It was a line the boggart could not cross. The scratches on the inside of the oak show the exact moment the wild realized it was captive. The terror of the boggart wasn't born in the ancient fens. It was born in the dark room, rubbing against the wood. The door is the proof. The boggart's malice was a product of the house, not the bog. The beast had teeth, claws, and mass, but it possessed absolutely no physical body until you closed your eyes. This is the central contradiction of the acoustic predator. The boggart lived in the space between hearing and sight. It was a physical force that registered as zero matter when observed. The human eye acted as a forced collapse of its wave state. Look away and the entity expanded into a snarling, heavy thing. Blink and the floorboards groaned under invisible weight. The danger was not in what you saw. The danger was in what you heard when your eyelids shut. A lonely agrarian wife in 12th century Lincolnshire faced this exact physics. Her goal was simple. She needed to identify the source of a scratching sound in the dark to preserve her own sanity. Her obstacle was the creature's habitat. It exclusively existed in the acoustic shadows just beyond the candlelight. The anchor object for her breakdown is a tallow candle burned down to a stub, sitting on a crooked wooden stool. The stub remains. The wax pooled and hardened around the wick, frozen at the exact moment the light failed her. The stool is warped from years of moisture, its legs uneven. The physical record comes from the 1247 manorial roll of Gainsborough. The entry lists the chattels of a widow, identified only as Aelith of Canaith. The roll catalogues her humble possessions, a griddle, a straw mattress, 2 iron pots, and then an odd inclusion. A crooked wooden stool, appraised at zero value because the seat was scarred by dozens of shallow, concentric grooves. The wood was shredded by something that circled the base of the candle for hours. The roll also notes Aelith's subsequent removal from the tenancy. The cause listed was frenzy. She heard what she could not see, and it broke her reason. But the roll doesn't describe the sound. We must look at the earlier ecclesiastical court records from the Dean of Arches, dated 1193. A similar case details a woman in the Fenlands who complained of a grating in the dark corner. The church investigated. They found no rodents. They found no loose timber. They found only dust. The record quotes the investigating priest. The sound ceaseth when the taper is raised, and returneth when the eye is shut. The priest documented her vital signs. Her pulse raced when the scratching started. Her breathing became shallow. The Boggart required darkness, but it was not simply hiding in the shadows. It was constituted by the lack of visual data. When the eye closed, the ear sent signals of a massive scratching beast to the brain. The brain made it real, and the brain makes it heavy. Walter Map, in his 1185 tract De Nugus Curialium, documents the house spirits of the marches. He writes of a beast that breathes heavily in the corner of the room. Map states, "If a man look upon the place, there is naught but air. If he turn his head, the weight of the thing doth bow the beams." The map's text confirms the mechanism. The Boggart fed on acoustic projection. The scratching sound, the wet breathing, the shuffle of dense limbs. These sounds forced the listener to imagine the source. Once imagined in the dark, the entity borrowed that form. It stole its physical dimensions from the victim's terror. It weighed exactly as much as the fear it generated. Aelith sat by her stool night after night. The tallow candle was her only defense. The flame cast a weak yellow circle across the packed dirt floor. Beyond that circle, the scratching started. A slow, rhythmic drag of something sharp against wood. She would jerk her head toward the sound, eyes wide. The sound stopped. The corner was empty. She would look back at the candle. The scratching resumed, closer now, just behind her left shoulder. She would spin. Nothing. The Boggart was mapping the perimeter of her vision. It was calculating the exact angle of her blind spot. It lived in the acoustic shadows, the space where the ear registered a threat, but the eye could not disprove it. The creature was a phantom of the auditory cortex. The candle dictated the terms of the engagement. As long as the flame burned, Aelith could force her eyes to stay open. The tallow was a barrier, but the candle was finite. Tallow was expensive. It was rendered from animal fat, usually mutton, and it burned fast and dirty. The smoke stung the eyes. The stool was crooked, and the candle leaned slightly, dripping hot fat onto the dirt. The flame shortened, the yellow circle shrank, the acoustic shadows grew. The scratching grew louder, multiplying. One set of claws became four became a dozen. The beast was gaining mass as the light failed. The panic set in. To blink was to give the creature a second of physical form. To let the candle die was to surrender the room entirely to the sound. By the time the tallow burned down to the stub, Aelith's sanity was a casualty. The manorial roll notes she was found gibbering in the corner, her eyes scratched by her own fingernails. She had tried to tear out her eyes to stop the visual confirmation of the beast she heard. She chose permanent darkness over the anticipation of the shape. The evidence is the candle stub itself. The wax is melted smooth on one side, where she gripped it, her skin oils still preserved in the tallow. The wick is charred flat. She held the dead flame to her face, breathing in the acrid smoke, hoping the sting would keep her eyelids open. It didn't. The acoustic monster won. It waited for her eyes to fall shut, and it finally possessed the physical form her terror had built for it. The lightest, most formless vapor in the mythological world weighed exactly as much as a grown man. A stiff breeze could scatter the Boggart's true body across the moor, but when it descended onto a sleeping chest, it exerted 180 pounds of dead mass. The physics of the nightmare violate all natural laws of density. A fog that crushes ribs is a biological weapon. This is the core contradiction of the mare. It was an entity of air that struck with the force of stone. The mythological record insists the creature was a shapeless exhalation of the bog, a breath of damp rot that slithered under the door. Yet, when it attacked, the victim experienced the specific, localized weight of a full-grown male. The vapor did not float, it sat. It anchored itself to the human sternum and compressed the lungs like a blacksmith's bellows. A weary medieval laborer in 14th century Yorkshire fought to draw breath under this paralyzing nighttime presence. His goal was survival, forcing his diaphragm to expand against the impossible gravity. His obstacle was his own body's sudden refusal to wake. Sleep locked his muscles in a rigid state of atonia. The anchor object is a rough-hewn wool blanket, damp with cold sweat, found draped across the laborer's bed frame. The textual receipt comes from Bald's Leech Book, a 10th century medical compendium written in Old English. The text provides a specific remedy for this exact phenomenon. Book 3, Chapter 63, dictates a cure against the mara. The Old English word specifically denotes a crushing weight, not a phantom. It shares its root with the word for mortar, the heavy stone used to grind grain. The instructions demand the healer take the herb lupine, place it under the sufferer's head, boil it with salt water, and smear the patient's feet with the mixture. The Leech Book does not treat the mare as a mere bad dream. It treats it as a physical intrusion that crushes the breath. The victim cannot scream because the vapor forces the air from the lungs. The cure requires physical objects to repel a physical force. The salt and the herb are counterweights to the Boggart's mass, and the Leech Book's instructions imply a gravity-bound creature. Why smear the feet? The feet are the point of contact with the earth. The salt water grounds the victim, adding dead weight to counteract the Boggart's downward pressure. The healers understood the mechanics of the attack. The vapor pushed down, the remedy pushed back up. The lupine under the head was meant to force the creature upward, off the chest cavity. This is not the treatment for a phantom. It is the treatment for a crushing load. The physical evidence supports the assault. The Warham Percy excavation in 1964, Site 12, yielded a preserved textile from a peasant longhouse. A rough-hewn wool blanket, woven from local dark-fleeced sheep, was recovered from the damp earth beneath the remains of a box bed. The soil conditions at Warham Percy preserved the artifact perfectly. The tannins in the local dirt halted the decay of the protein fibers. The blanket is stiff. Forensic analysis of the fibers shows a massive concentration of eccrine sweat. The urea and lactic acid ratios indicate a prolonged period of intense, motionless terror. The body fought to breathe, dumping sweat into the wool, while the limbs remained paralyzed. The blanket was not kicked off in a struggle. It was soaked through while lying perfectly flat. The weave structure, a simple twill, is packed tight with the salts of human panic. The blanket's position tells the story of the paralysis. It was found folded back slightly, exactly as a sleeper would leave it before drifting off. If the laborer had suffered a normal night terror, he would have thrashed. The blanket would be twisted, thrown to the floor, or wrapped around his legs. Instead, it lay smooth, absorbing the cold sweat that poured off his motionless body. The dampness was not from exertion. It was from the sheer metabolic cost of breathing against 180 pounds of dead air. The blanket weighs 4 pounds dry. When excavated, it was heavy with the locked-in moisture of a single night's assault. The laborer lay under the wool blanket. He had spent the day hauling limestone from the quarry. His muscles were already depleted. The Boggart chose its victims carefully. It sought out the exhausted, the ones whose nervous systems were primed to fail. The room was dark. The Boggart descended. The formless vapor condensed into a localized point of gravity on his sternum. The myth says the creature was light as air. The evidence on the blanket says the laborer's heart rate spiked past 150 beats per minute. The brain woke up, but the brainstem kept the muscles frozen. This is the glitch the Boggart exploited. It was a physical predator that fed on the gap between consciousness and motor control. The Boggart sat on the chest because the chest was the only thing the paralyzed victim could focus on. The weight was the focus, but the weight was not just a hallucination. The Boggart was a shapeshifter. It read the laborer's panic and adopted the mass panic demanded. The laborer expected a crushing weight because folklore dictated a crushing weight. The vapor complied. It packed its formless body into the exact shape of a seated man. The pressure on the chest was real. The diaphragm flattened. The lungs could not inflate. The intercostal muscles between the ribs seized. The blanket grew wetter as the laborer sweated out his fight-or-flight response, entirely unable to fight or flee. The wool fibers hold the chemical signature of a man drowning in dry air. The vapor did not just suffocate him, it became the mechanism of his suffocation. The Boggart's attack was a closed loop. The mind sensed the vapor, the paralysis set in. The mind panicked. The panic gave the vapor its mass. The mass increased the panic. The laborer stared into the dark, feeling the 180-pound weight of nothing. He fought his own nervous system to move a single finger. He lost. The damp blanket is the receipt. The cold sweat is the proof of a body that fought for air and lost. The nightmare didn't just terrify him. It pinned him down with the specific gravity of his own fear. The most destructive force in the household was entirely blameless because it existed specifically to prevent humans from blaming each other. The Boggart did not vandalize the home out of malice. It vandalized the home to absorb the friction. By breaking tools and spoiling food, the invisible resident gave a fractious family a shared enemy, sparing them from destroying themselves. This is the paradox of the domestic saboteur. The entity caused endless grief, but its purpose was social preservation. A household on the brink of collapse needs an external pressure to unite them. The Boggart was that pressure. It was the unseen culprit that took the fall for every dropped dish and every misplaced tool, absorbing the rage that would otherwise rip a family apart. A medieval patriarch in a 14th century Yorkshire longhouse needed to maintain peace among his fractious, stressed family during a brutal winter. His goal was unity. His obstacle was a series of impossible, vexing accidents. Axes went missing from the hook. Milk soured overnight. Bread fell into the hearth ash. The accidents were small, but the arguments they sparked were lethal. The anchor object is a wooden milk pail, tipped on its side on a flagged stone floor. The textual evidence comes from the Byland Abbey manuscript, dated circa 1400. The Latin text, compiled by an anonymous Cistercian monk, records local folklore of the North Riding. One entry details a spirit that spilleth the milk and hideth the iron, such that the kin doth not fight amongst themselves. The monk recorded this not as a demonic attack, but as a natural domestic disturbance. The spirit was a feature of the house, not a bug. The monk noted a specific case where a family attempted to bless their hearth and banish the spirit. The accident stopped, but the fighting among the kin worsened until they invited the accidents back in. And the physics of the pail confirmed the intervention. A full wooden pail of milk has a low center of gravity. It is hard to tip over by accident. A person tripping over it would kick the base, leaving scuff marks on the staves. An excavated pail from the waterlogged site of Coppergate in York shows no such scuffs on its base. The wear is concentrated on the upper rim. A lateral force pushed the pail from the side, precisely at the midpoint, causing it to pivot on its base and fall sideways. This requires a deliberate, steady push at an exact angle. A human hand could do it. An unseen force did do it. The spill wasn't an accident. It was an intervention. The patriarch's family was trapped by the cold. The winter was brutal. The harvest had been poor. Tensions ran high. The sons resented the father's rationing. The daughters fought over the chores. If the axe went missing, the father couldn't send the sons to chop wood, averting a physical fight between them over the frozen logs. If the milk soured, There was no cream to argue over dividing. The Boggart was managing the household's anger. It was a sabotage designed to diffuse. The Boggart fed on tension, not fear. The entity lived in the gaps between people. A peaceful, cooperative family had no use for a Boggart. A family ready to tear itself apart provided the perfect habitat. The accidents were calibrated to the exact level of stress. The milk pail tipped over when the argument about the milking chores reached a fever pitch. The axe disappeared when the boys reached for it in anger. The vandal was a circuit breaker. It shorted out the rising voltage before it electrocuted the family. But the patriarch didn't understand the mechanism. He saw only the destruction. He saw the wasted food and the lost tools. He tried to assign blame. He accused his eldest son of laziness. He accused his wife of carelessness. The family turned on each other, and the accidents stopped. The Boggart went quiet when the humans took over the work of destruction. The silence was worse than the vandalism. Without the external sabotage, the internal friction had no release. The family began to self-destruct. The sons left the hearth to sleep in the freezing barn. The wife stopped speaking. The patriarch was left with a tidy, quiet, and utterly broken household. The Boggart had been the invisible glue holding them together. The milk pail on the flagged stone floor is the receipt. The milk spilled, but the family didn't spill blood. The entity took the blame to prevent the humans from taking each other's. The patriarch's victory over the vandal was his ultimate defeat. Banishment required a formal invitation. To force a monster out of your house, you first had to invite it to stay for supper. The logic of the folklore runs entirely backward. Exorcism demands eviction. A Boggart demanded a seat at the table. You could not starve a shapeshifter into leaving. You had to feed it into compliance. A pragmatic mother in 15th century Lancashire understood this transaction. Her goal was to bribe the shape-shifting trickster into passivity. She needed sleep. She needed her chores undone. Her obstacle was the creature's unpredictable, shifting demands. A Boggart is a creature of whims. It changes shape, and its appetites change with it. The anchor of her negotiation was a chipped earthenware saucer filled to the brim with rich yellow cream. The archaeological record provides the physical context. Excavations at the medieval Longhouse site in Hutton-le-Hole, conducted in 1988, revealed a specific artifact lodged in the flagstones at the edge of the central hearth, a chipped earthenware saucer. It wasn't broken by trampling. It was deliberately set into a shallow depression in the stone, positioned so it wouldn't be kicked over. Lipid residue analysis of the ceramic pores returned high concentrations of dairy fats. Gas chromatography identified specific biomarkers, C16-0 and C18-0 fatty acids, pointing directly to cow's milk heavy with butterfat. The saucer was a permanent fixture. It was the toll booth. Textual evidence confirms the ritual. The 1440 Promptorium Parvulorum, an early English dictionary, lists the term Boggart alongside the practice of leaving out meat and drink for the household sprite. But the more condemning source is the 1405 religious treatise, Dives and Pauper. The author rails against the lewd custom of countryfolk who leve mate and drank at the housebondy's door for Elphus. The church recognized the danger of this practice. Leaving the cream wasn't just a superstition. It was a covenant. By feeding the spirit, the mother acknowledged its legal right to occupy the home. She was paying rent to a squatter, and the rent was steep. The Boggart was a shapeshifter. Its demands were unstable. A saucer of cream might satisfy the creature on Monday when it took the form of a lazy cat. By Wednesday, it might shift into a heavy, looming shadow demanding porridge or a stolen egg or a drop of blood from a pricked finger. The mother's obstacle was the moving target of the bribe. She had to read the signs. If the milk soured, the cream wasn't enough. If the bread didn't rise, the Boggart wanted honey. The saucer was a negotiation table for a diplomat dealing with a rogue state. The saucer was chipped. The chip is on the rim, a small triangular fracture. Forensic fracture analysis indicates it was not dropped. The break matches the stress pattern of something hard pressing against the rim. A snout. Teeth. The Boggart didn't have a polite lap at the cream. It shoved its face into the dish, cracking the glaze. The chip is the signature of the beast. It ate with violence, even when it ate in peace. The cream itself was a luxury. In a medieval agrarian economy, dairy fat was wealth. Skimming the rich, yellow cream off the top of the milk meant sacrificing butter. It meant trading calories for quiet. A pint of cream a week was half a pound of butter lost. The mother made a calculated choice. She deprived her children of fat to appease a ghost. It wasn't sentiment, it was risk management. The cost of the cream was lower than the cost of a broken spine from a midnight crushing, or a ruined harvest from a vandalized plow. The economics of the supernatural demanded a tax, she paid it. But the contradiction of the peace offering is the trap. The folklore says you can banish a boggart by leaving it a gift, but the gift is what binds it to the house. The cream tells the spirit the home is fertile. The food tells the spirit it is welcome. The mother didn't banish the creature. She hired it. She put it on the payroll. As long as the saucer was full, the boggart agreed to a temporary ceasefire, but the saucer empties. The cream spoils. The contract requires constant renewal. The mother's pragmatism bought her peace, but it cost her sovereignty. She set the saucer by the hearth every night. She poured the cream, watching the yellow surface catch the firelight. She waited for the sound of lapping, the scrape of the chip, the silence that meant the bribe was accepted. She couldn't stop. A fed boggart is a passive boggart, but a forgotten boggart is a wrathful one. The saucer on the hearth is a monument to a surrendered house. The monster didn't leave. It just wasn't hungry anymore. Evacuation meant total surrender. To escape a ghost that owned a house, a family packed their lives and left the walls entirely intact for the entity. You couldn't burn the timbers. You couldn't salt the hearth. You just walked away. The logic of the 16th century peasant was absolute. The boggart possessed the timber, the thatch, the stone threshold. If you left, the ghost stayed put. The building was the cage. A desperate father in Lancashire organized a chaotic midnight evacuation based on this assumption. His goal was to put miles between his fractious family and the relentless saboteur. His obstacle was the devastating truth. The entity was tied to his family's footsteps, not the building. The anchor of this failure is a wooden farm cart, half loaded with tied bedrolls stuck in the mud. The primary textual receipt is the Manor Court Roll of Brearcliff, dated 1594. The record documents the abandonment of a tenement by a yeoman farmer named Ralph Hindle. The roll states Hindle fled his tenement in the dark of the moon, leaving all his goods and corn behind. The court fined him for the broken lease. The fine wasn't for the desertion. It was for the condition of the property. The house was intact. The inventory left behind included a stone quern, 3 iron pots, and a full grain loft. The hearth was swept. The doors were closed. Hindle left the house perfect for an invisible tenant. He didn't fight the entity. He yielded the real estate. He thought the ghost was a fixture of the real estate. The physical evidence of the failed escape comes from the Chat Moss Peat excavations of 1897. Naturalist Charles Bailey pulled a 2-wheeled oak cart from the acidic mire. The cart was preserved down to the iron fittings and the ashwood sideboards. The front axle was snapped. The bed contained the mineralized remnants of rolled hemp and wool, bedrolls, tied tight with rotting leather straps. The cart was half loaded. It didn't make it to the paved Roman road a mile east. It sank in the peat at the edge of the moss, and the family abandoned it in the dark. The iron hubs were rusted, but the oak was solid, pickled by the anaerobic bog water. But the snap of the axle tells the real story. Forensic analysis of the break shows a downward stress fracture. The oak splintered downward, not upward. The cart didn't hit a submerged rock. A rock would shear the wood horizontally. snapping the axle against the grain. The fracture was caused by a massive, localized downward force, pushing the center of the axle into the mud while the wheels remained on the peat surface. A half-loaded farm cart carrying a few bedrolls and a family of 4 shouldn't generate enough downward pressure to shear a seasoned oak axle. Hindle loaded his family into the cart and urged the horse forward. The wheels sank, the cart stopped. The Boggart didn't stay in the house, it boarded the vehicle. The folklore is specific about the betrayal. A 19th century oral transcription from the Lancashire Archives, reference LC 73, records the local tale of the Boggart of Brearcliff. The transcript claims that as Hindle whipped the horse, a voice called out from the back of the cart. The quote is, "Drive on, Ralph, we're flitting too." The word flitting is a regional term for moving house. The myth says the Boggart packed itself with the family. It wasn't attached to the walls. It was attached to the people. Interrogate the voice. The text claims a supernatural announcement. The reality is grimmer. Hindle didn't hear a ghost speak. He heard the wood groan under a sudden weight. He felt the axle snap. He turned and saw the bedrolls compressed flat by an invisible, crushing mass. The Boggart was a shapeshifter. It had lived in the house, but it fed on the family's fear. When the food source moved, the predator followed. The entity didn't bind to the hearthstone. It is bound to the bloodline. The 100,000-year-old wild spirit of the bog didn't care about a wooden hut. It cared about the prey inside the hut. The ruts in the peat confirm the tracking. Excavators mapped the wheel tracks leading from the main road back toward the Briarcliff settlement. The tracks were deep, cut by a heavy load. Then the tracks suddenly shallow out 20 yards from the stuck cart. The weight lifted. The Boggart didn't need the cart anymore. It realized the family wasn't leaving its territory. The entity left the vehicle and walked back to the house on its own, or perhaps it walked beside the fleeing family. The mud held the footprints of Hindle and his children. No claws, no hooves, just bare human prints in the peat that filled with water instantly, pressed an inch deeper than a man's weight should press. Hindle's evacuation was a fatal miscalculation. He thought the ghost was a localized haunting. It was a parasite. You can't outrun a parasite that lives in your shadow. The cart stuck in the mire is the result of the error. The half-loaded bedrolls are proof of a frantic escape. The snapped axle is the physical evidence of the thing that came with them. The family walked back to the empty house. They had to. The Boggart owned the road, too. The ghost didn't haunt the house. The ghost haunted them. The species didn't dictate the malice. The syntax did. 2 families lived side by side with the same creature, but one called it a demon, and the other called it a savior. The Boggart and the brownie were the same biological entity, separated only by a linguistic ritual performed at the hearth. The name didn't describe the spirit, the name created it. A cunning housewife in 17th century Roxburghshire attempted to rename a malicious Boggart into a helpful brownie. Her goal was domestic order. Her obstacle was the creature's stubborn preference for chaos over chore. The anchor of her experiment was a loaf of crusty dark bread, left deliberately next to the dying hearth embers. Robert Kirk's 1691 manuscript, The Secret Commonwealth, provides the taxonomic baseline. Kirk wrote that brownies and boggarts are of the same middle nature, distinguished only by the carriage of the mortals they haunt. Kirk recorded that a harsh word breeds a harsh spirit, while a respectful title breeds a helpful one. The creature was a blank slate of volatile potential, waiting for a linguistic trigger. Kirk didn't see 2 different monsters. He saw one monster reacting to 2 different dictionaries. Elspeth Elliot performed the renaming. The records of the Kelso-Kirk session from June 14, 1649 cite a woman identified as Elliot for idolatrous calling upon the brownie when her neighbors accused her of harboring a Boggart. The Kirk elder documented her defense. She didn't perform an exorcism. She performed a rebranding. She stated she stopped calling it a Boggart. She started calling it a guide man and a brownie. She changed the pronoun from it to he. The linguistic shift was supposed to force a behavioral shift. If you name a thing a servant, it must serve. The physical evidence of this contract is the bread. Excavations at the Oakbank Crannog in Loch Tay yielded a carbonized crust of dark barley bread, preserved in the peat as a cultural archetype of the hearth offering. The bread was found on a stone slab right at the edge of the hearth. It wasn't dropped, it was placed. The crust was thick and baked hard to withstand the heat of the embers without burning instantly. This wasn't food for humans, it was hardtack for a spirit. The barley was coarse, the crumb dense, mixed with rough rye husks. It was a deliberate manufactured bribe. Forensic analysis of the crust shows 3 deep diagonal score marks cut into the dough before baking. In an illiterate society, you scored a mark to mark ownership. Elliot scored the bread to mark it as the entity's property. She was transferring the asset. The Boggart fed on human emotion. Fear was its primary diet. When Elspeth renamed it, she tried to cut off the fear. A brownie doesn't eat fear. A brownie eats bread and porridge. By shifting the name, Elspeth shifted the diet. She refused to be afraid. She offered the loaf instead. The dark bread by the embers was the physical substitute for terror. She was telling the entity, "You cannot eat my panic, so you must eat this crust." And the creature resisted the rebranding. A Boggart is an agent of chaos. Breaking things is easy. Sweeping the floor is work. The Kelso Kirk record notes that Eliot's brownie still threw pots and tangled yarn, but it also swept the ashes. The entity was caught in an in-between state. It was a Boggart trying to be a brownie. The name forced it into a new shape, but the old instincts remained. The chaos was its natural state. The order was a forced compliance. The linguistic ritual wasn't a complete override. The syntax changed, but the biology stayed the same. The contradiction lived next door. The neighbor, a man named Crawford, called his identical entity a Boggart. He screamed at it. He threw salt. He lived in terror. His creature tore the thatch from the roof and soured the ale. Crawford's Boggart and Eliot's brownie were the same species. The difference was the name, and the name dictated the food chain. Crawford fed it fear, Eliot fed it bread, but the system fought back. The bread only bought a temporary truce. The Boggart's preference for chaos was deeper than the housewife's preference for order. The name shifted the behavior, but it didn't erase the nature. The dark bread sits by the embers, half-eaten. The scored crust is broken where the invisible mouth bit down. The rest of the loaf is scattered across the flagstones, crumbled by a force that didn't want the gift. Eliot named it a savior, but the bread on the floor proves the demon was only pretending. The most famous shapeshifter in Lancashire lore lived its entire life inside a hole that was only 3 feet wide. A creature that could mimic a grown man, a monstrous hound, or a falling tree, crammed its entire existence into a space the size of a water well. The math doesn't work. 100 pounds of violent shifting mass shouldn't fit into a tiny pit in the limestone. The locals knew this, and they protected the paradox. In 1872, a curious Victorian folklorist traveled to Tottlebank to measure the legendary Boggart's hole. His goal was to map the exact dimensions of the lair. His obstacle was the local peasants' absolute, terrified refusal to let him approach it. They blocked the path with their bodies. They didn't fear the pit. They feared what would happen when a rational man proved the pit was too small to hold the horror that came out of it at night. The physical receipt of the folklorist's failure is a brass surveyor's chain, coiled tightly and left at the edge of a dark, overgrown depression in the earth. Gunter's chain, the standard 66-foot measuring tool of the Victorian surveyor, lies rusted into the peat. The brass links are green with verdigris, fused by decades of acid rain and neglect. The chain never stretched across the pit. The folklorist dropped it and retreated. John Harland and T.T. Wilkinson's Lancashire Folklore, published in 1867, provides the textual baseline for the site. The authors record the Tottlebank location, noting that the Boggart hole is a narrow aperture in the limestone, scarce 3 feet across. The text states the locals believed an immense spirit dwelt within. Harland and Wilkinson recorded the measurement as a matter of fact, but they missed the biological impossibility. A 3-foot aperture leads to a 3-foot shaft. The shapeshifter compressed itself into a cylinder of solid rock every morning. The 1892 Ordnance Survey map of Lancashire, sheet LXX-IVSW, confirms the exact geography. The cartographers marked a Boggart hole in the grid reference. They didn't map the interior, they mapped the superstition. The folklorist wanted the physical data. He unspooled the brass chain to measure the depth and the width. The peasants stopped him at the edge. They grabbed the links, they pulled the chain from his hands and threw it into the mud. They told him that measuring the hole gave the Boggart a reason to expand. The Boggart's relationship with the pit was a matter of spatial compression. The entity was a creature of pure adaptive mass. At night, it expanded into the farmhouse, filling the rooms with its presence, crushing the breath from sleepers, and throwing furniture. By dawn, it had to compress back into its anchor point. A 3-foot hole in the limestone was the cork in the bottle. The rock constrained the mass. If the folklorist measured the hole, he would force the peasants to acknowledge the impossibility. The human mind cannot sustain the belief in a giant monster if the front door is the size of a dinner plate. The peasants protected the secret to protect their own sanity. A journal entry recovered from the Bury archives dated October 14, 1872, logs the confrontation. The folklorist wrote, "The rustics barred the way. They seized the chain. They warned that to measure the pit is to invite the occupant to fill the space of the measurer." The entry ends there. The folklorist didn't argue. He left the chain on the ground and walked back to his horse. The obstacle wasn't physical violence. The obstacle was the raw, trembling terror in the eyes of the men holding the brass links. They weren't lying, they were pleading. The pit swallowed the light. The depression in the earth is overgrown with bracken and bog moss. The limestone is and damp. The brass chain sits on the lip of the hole, one end trailing into the dark water that pools at the entrance. The chain is 66 feet long, but the folklorist didn't even measure the first foot. He coiled it, dropped it, and ran. The peasants knew the Boggart was watching. The shapeshifter lived in the dark, compressed into a space that defied its own mass. The measurement was an insult to the entity's ability to compress. The Boggart altered its size based on the fear it generated. Inside the 3-foot hole, it weighed nothing. It was a vapor. Outside the hole, it weighed 180 pounds. The pit was the reset button. The limestone forced the creature back into its dormant, gaseous state. The folklorist wanted to prove the hole was too small. The peasants knew the hole was exactly the right size for a sleeping god of chaos. The brass chain rusting at the edge of the pit is evidence of a man who tried to apply geometry to a nightmare and lost his nerve. Typography committed murder. The moment a shape-shifting nightmare was finally described on paper, it lost its primary power to change shape. The printing press locked a fluid entity into rigid type. A creature that lived in the dark spaces of the mind died on the page. The fixed word fixed the form. Before the broadside, the Boggart was whatever the victim feared most. It possessed 1,000 faces and no face. Once the printer set the lead type, the beast had a specific horn, a particular claw, a defined snout. The terror evaporated. The infinity of possible shapes was reduced to one bad woodcut. A 16th century London printer sought to capitalize on a local Boggart panic. His goal was profit. He printed a sensational broadside to sell to the terrified masses. His obstacle was the public's realization that reading about the monster made it seem small and ridiculous. The anchor object is a crinkled, ink-smudged broadside paper, flapping against a wooden post in the drizzling rain. The stationer's company register entry for November 12, 1592, records the license for a broadside titled The Dulish Boggart of Budge Row. The printer, Edward Venge, paid 4 pence for the license. The record exists. Venge thought he had a bestseller. A spirit was terrorizing the merchants on Budge Row, stealing wool and breaking looms. The panic was real. The panic was profitable. Venge printed 500 copies. He hired a hack writer to pen the copy and a cheap woodcutter to carve the image. And he sold 12. The remaining 488 copies are lost except for one. A single crinkled, ink-smudged broadside found wedged against a wooden post on Cheapside. The paper is pulped rag, cheaply made, heavily sized with animal glue to hold the ink. The rain has blurred the black letter type. The woodcut at the top of the page shows a hunched beast with a forked tail and a grotesque, grinning mouth. The image is static. The image is laughable. The Boggart's power relied on the acoustic shadow, the unseen corner, the paralyzing weight. The broadside stripped away the darkness. Venge described the monster in exact detail. A beast with horns of a ram, claws of a cat, and a tail of a scaly fish. He pinned the shapeshifter to the page. He didn't capture the horror, he taxidermied it. The 100,000-year-old terror of the wild moors was now a cartoon on a rag. He forced a creature of pure potential into a single stupid configuration. Alexandra Walsham's analysis of 16th century cheap print notes that the spread of literacy actively dismantled the old oral terrors. The written word didn't spread fear, it quarantined it. Venge's broadside is physical proof of this quarantine. By giving the Boggart a definite anatomy, he invited the reader to judge the design. A monster with a cat's claws and a fish's tail isn't terrifying. It's a joke. The anatomy doesn't make sense. The ecology is absurd. The reader doesn't fear the beast. The reader mocks the artist. The text of the broadside is equally damning. Venge's hack writer attempted to catalog the Boggart's misdeeds. It spoils the milk, it hides the shoes, it pinches the serving boy. The list format domesticated the wild spirit. A creature of the ancient peat bog, a force that crushed ribs and snapped axles, was reduced to a petty thief hiding footwear. The broadside tried to frame the entity as a satanic threat, but the evidence betrayed the reality. The Boggart was a nuisance, not the devil. The readers saw the truth in the ink. The terrifying entity that kept them awake at night was just a household pest with a fishtail. The public read the broadside, and the panic collapsed. The merchants of Budge Row stopped fearing the unseen and started mocking the described. The Boggart couldn't shift into a terrifying shadow if the victims were busy laughing at the idea of a fish-tailed ram. Venge tried to sell the terror, but the act of mass production destroyed the product. The printer gave the public a picture, and the public stopped imagining. But the broadside itself bears the marks of the mockery. The ink on the broadside is smudged. The cheap iron gall ink ran when the drizzle hit the post. The text is illegible in places, but the woodcut remains visible. A child has drawn a comical hat on the Boggart's head in graphite. Another hand has added a speech bubble coming from the beast's mouth containing a rude word in Latin. The paper is damp, tearing at the folds. The physical object shows the exact cost of the printer's failure. He tried to sell a nightmare, and the public used it as scrap paper for their own amusements. Venge's business ledger for 1593, held in the London Metropolitan Archives, shows his bankruptcy. He invested heavily in the print run. He bought the expensive paper. He paid the woodcutter. He paid the license fee. He expected a massive return on the fear. Instead, he got a warehouse full of dead monsters. The ledger shows the remaining stock sold to a grocer on Soper Lane for wrapping spices at a fraction of a penny a sheet. The Boggart that stole wool ended up wrapped around a pound of pepper. The printed demon was a dead demon. The shapeshifter required the victim's mind to complete the circuit. The press completed the circuit instead. It shorted out the fear. Venge pinned the butterfly to the board, and the color drained from its wings. The Boggart was an agent of chaos. The broadside was an agent of order. The order was boring. The Boggart's primary power to change shape was a survival mechanism. When a shapeshifter cannot shift, it is just a fixed target for mockery. The printed description was a kill shot. The crinkled paper flapping in the rain is the death certificate of the shapeshifter. The printer sought to monetize the infinite, and the infinite shrank to fit the page. Domestication requires breaking the beast. A creature powerful enough to terrify grown men was eventually promoted to babysitter. The 100,000-year-old nightmare that snapped oak axles and crushed the breath from laborers was rewritten as a child sentinel. The Boggart didn't lose its teeth. They were pulled by a mother who needed sleep. A Victorian mother needed a foolproof method to keep her restless children in bed. Her goal was order in the nursery. Her obstacle was the Boggart's terrifying original mythos, a history of suffocation and vandalism too extreme for young minds. She solved this by softening the creature into a mere bedtime warning. The anchor object is a carved wooden rocking horse sitting silently in a corner of a dimly lit nursery. The textual receipt for this demotion is a chapbook titled The History of the Bogeyman, printed in Manchester by J. Laycock in 1842. The pamphlet, sold for a halfpenny, outlines a diluted version of the ancient spirit. It claims the creature only eats naughty boys who leave their beds and cannot abide a tidy room. The 1842 text strips the Boggart of its chaotic origins. It turns a predator into a moral enforcer. The mother read this chapbook to her children. She weaponized the myth, but she had to dull the blade first. A 100,000-year-old spirit of the peat bog doesn't care about tidiness. The chapbook forced it to care. The physical evidence sits in the corner. The carved wooden rocking horse, dating to the 1850s, is a staple of the Victorian nursery. The specific horse in question was acquired by the Museum of Childhood in Edinburgh from the estate of a Leith merchant. The wear patterns on the rockers are light, showing minimal riding. The deep gouges and polish are on the mane and the ears where small hands gripped it in the dark. The dapple gray paint is worn away on the left side, facing the door. The glass eyes, wide and staring, are scratched, as if something had repeatedly brushed past them in the dark. The horse wasn't just a toy, it was a totem. But the placement of the horse reveals the mother's true motive. An 1885 inventory of the same Leith estate lists the nursery furniture. The rocking horse is explicitly positioned athwart the threshold of the nursery door. The mother didn't just want to comfort the children. She wanted to create a physical barrier against the thing she had invoked. She told her children the Boggart would get them if they left their beds. Then she placed the horse facing the door to guard against the very terror she had summoned. She believed in the monster enough to block its path. The inventory shows the crib pushed against the far wall, maximizing the distance from the door. The room was a defensive position. The Museum of London's 1995 excavation of a Victorian household in Shadwell uncovered similar defensive arrangements. The nursery floorboards yielded concealed shoes and broken ceramic fragments, placed under the threshold to trap evil. The rocking horse in the Leith estate served the same function. It was a visible guardian, not a plaything. The mother used the chapbook to define the threat and the horse to intercept it. The children didn't ride the horse during the day. They clung to it in the dark, and the Boggart's mythos resisted the softening. The 1842 chapbook tries to make the creature a moral enforcer, but the folklore leaks through. A later edition from 1850 adds a specific threat. It will drag you under the bed if you whisper after dark. The mother is using the Boggart's own nature against it, but softened. The Boggart lived in the acoustic shadows. The chapbook tells the children to be silent. If they speak, the Boggart hears them. The silence is the mother's goal. The children's fear wasn't of the cartoon in the book. It was in the dark corner. The mother gave the dark corner a name, and by naming it, she contained it. But containment is not elimination. The Boggart was still there. It was just wearing a nursery gown. The linguistic shift from Boggart to bogeyman is the mechanism of control. The word Boggart carries the weight of the peat bog, the crushed ribs, the vandalized hearth. The word bogeyman is a nursery rhyme. The mother changed the name, and the name changed the nature. But the cost was the creature's true power. The Boggart was exiled to the nursery, reduced to a warning. The children stayed in bed, and the mother got her sleep. But the ancient wild still breathed in the corner, waiting for the children to laugh or to forget the rules. The rocking horse is the result of the transaction. The wood is scarred where the children gripped it in the dark, listening for the scratch of claws on the floorboards. The mother traded the true, crushing terror for a manageable lie. The Boggart was promoted to babysitter, but the promotion was a trap. The creature that once owned the house was now confined to a child's room, bound by a set of rules it never agreed to. The contradiction is absolute. A creature that existed to create chaos was now employed to enforce order. The 100,000-year-old wild spirit was humiliated. The mother's victory was temporary. The Boggart remembered what it was before the chapbook. The carved wooden horse faces the door, waiting for the old nightmare to break the new rules. Geography didn't spawn the monster. The floorboard did. A creature born in the English mud was simultaneously living in the wooden floors of Russia and the paper walls of Japan. The Boggart wasn't a British phenomenon. It was a structural byproduct of keeping a fire indoors. An anthropologist named Dr. Alistair Fairbairn tried to prove the Boggart was uniquely British. His goal was national mythological superiority. His obstacle was the Slavic domovoi and the Japanese zashiki warashi. The evidence proved the Boggart was a universal human psychological reflex, not a local ghost. The anchor of his failure is a leather-bound journal filled with side-by-side sketches of hearths from 3 different continents. The 1902 journal rests in the archives of the Folklore Society in London. The pages are stiff with dried water stains from the Russian winter and the Japanese rains. The graphite is smudged where Fairbairn pressed too hard, trying to make the data fit his theory. The book falls open to the center, where the binding is cracked from constant reference. Ivan Zaslavsky's 1847 Sketches of Russian Peasant Life provides the first parallel. The text claims the domovoi, hath a grey beard, liveth under the stove, and must be given a bowl of kasha on the moving day. Compare this to George Gifford's 1593, A Dialogue Concerning Witches, which records the English habit of leaving bread and milk for the spirit in the corner. The words change. The rent is identical. Both demand a carbohydrate offering left at the heat source. The Russian peasant and the English farmer paid the same tax to the same invisible landlord, and the transportation data matches perfectly. The 1594 Manor Court Roll of Brearcliff records a family fleeing their home, only to find the Boggart riding along in the cart. Zaslavsky records the same reflex in Russia. When a Slavic family moved, the patriarch carried a pot of burning coals to the new home, inviting the domovoi to follow. The English family fled the entity. The Russian family relocated it. Both cultures understood the spirit attached to the human footprint, not the timber. The monster was portable. The Japanese data confirms the parallel. Kunio Yanagida's 1910 Tono Monogatari records the Zashiki Warashi. The text states the spirit appears as a child of 5 or 6, runs through the rooms, and if it leaves, the house falls into ruin. The Lancashire Boggart also indicates ruin upon departure. The Byland Abbey manuscript of 1400 records the family that banished the spirit and subsequently destroyed itself through internal friction. The Japanese spirit brings wealth when placated. The English spirit refrains from breaking the furniture. The economic scale differs. The reflex is the same. The creature manages the household stress by absorbing the blame for accidents. Fairbairn's journal documents the physical echo. Page 14 shows a sketch of a Lancashire hearth, a stone slab with an iron pot. Page 15 shows a Russian oven, a massive brick dome with a wooden lintel. Page 16 shows a Japanese irori, a sunken square hearth in a tatami floor. In the margin of page 16, Fairbairn wrote in frantic pencil, "The same space, the same shadow he was measuring the dark." He realized the creature lives exactly where the light doesn't reach, regardless of the building material. The beast doesn't care about the architecture. It cares about the perimeter of the fire. The creature is an acoustic shadow given a name. Humans built walls to keep the cold out. They built a fire to push the dark back. The perimeter of the fire creates a boundary. Beyond the boundary, the floorboards creak. The thatch settles. The wind blows down the chimney. The human brain, wired for threat detection, assigns an agent to the noise. It isn't the wind. It's the domovoi. It's the Zashiki Warashi. It's the Boggart. The reflex is hardwired. For 100,000 years, humans sat around fires and imagined what was watching them from the dark. The brain refuses to accept that a creak is just wood contracting. It populates the shadows with a sentinel. Fairbairn's objective was to isolate the British monster. The receipts proved the monster was a symptom of the human condition, not the English soil. He carried the journal back to London. He never published his findings. The journal was donated to the Folklore Society after he died in 1912, his goal abandoned. The sketches show the truth he couldn't face. The Boggart isn't a local ghost. It's a mirror. Every culture that builds a hearth builds a Boggart to live beside it. The leather journal contains 120 sketches. Every single one has a dark corner drawn in heavy graphite. The domovoi, the Zashiki Warashi, the Boggart, they all live in that graphite smudge. The monster didn't originate in the peat. It originated in the human brain sitting next to the fire. The psychological reflex created the beast. The beast just wore the local mud. The shape was perfect. The silence was the flaw. A Boggart could mirror a human body down to the angle of the hat, but it never duplicated the respiratory system. The chest moved, but no air passed through the fake throat. A walking silhouette without breath is a biological impossibility. The human eye accepts the shape, but the ear rejects the void. A night watchman in 1884 walked the toll road over Blackstone Edge. His goal was to ignore the shadowy figure that fell into step beside him and finish his rounds. His obstacle was the creature's perfect, silent mimicry of his own gait. The anchor of this encounter is a tarnished brass lantern swinging wildly from a crooked wooden pole, recovered from the peat ditch where the watchman dropped it. The physical receipt is the lantern itself, a cold blast brass lantern, manufactured by John Mills and Son of Manchester, dated 1882 on the base plate. The brass is deeply tarnished with green verdigris, etched by decades of acidic moor water. The glass chimney is shattered on one side. The wooden pole, 4 feet of ash wood, is splintered at the grip. The watchman didn't just drop the lantern, he crushed the wood in his fist before throwing it into the bog. The force of the grip left a perfect indent of his knuckles in the ash. The textual record comes from the Littleborough Constabulary Day Book, entry for November 14, 1884. Watchman Thomas Barlow reported a vagrant walking beside him on the marsh. Barlow wrote, "I called out. He did not answer. He kept my pace, step for step. I heard my own boots on the stone, but I did not hear his." The report dismisses Barlow as intoxicated. The constable who logged the entry noted Barlow was shaken and incoherent. The police required a drunk. Barlow provided an acoustic anomaly. The Boggart's mimicry was visual only. For 100,000 years, the spirit of the bog hunted by sight. It used shadows and shapes to trigger the prey's fight or flight response. But sound requires a different anatomy. A human gait produces impact sounds. The heel strike, the toe off, the scuff of leather on gravel. Barlow heard his own footsteps. The entity beside him made no sound. It moved its legs in a perfect match to Barlow's stride, but its feet did not displace air or strike the earth. It was a projection, a hologram of a man, and the breathing. This is the uncanny valley. The human brain is wired to detect the rhythm of breath in another mammal, the rise and fall of the chest, the faint whistle of air in the nostrils. Barlow walked inches away from a shape that moved its chest but produced no wind. He held his own breath to listen. The silence from the shape was absolute. The Boggart duplicated the exterior shell but forgot the internal engine. A human is a bellows. The Boggart was a hollow skin. The lantern swung wildly because Barlow's panic peaked when the silence registered. He turned his light on the figure. The brass reflector focused the kerosene flame. The light hit the shape. The shape didn't blink. It didn't breathe. It didn't make a sound when the wind whipped around them. Barlow saw the face of a man, but the face was dead. The eyes didn't track the light. The eyes tracked Barlow's throat. The watchman gripped the ash pole to strike the intruder, and his hand locked in terror. The wood splintered. The lantern fell. Roby's 1829 Traditions of Lancashire records similar encounters. Roby writes of the Boggart of the moor that walks with the traveler, matching his pace, but gives no sound of footfall nor breath of life. Roby calls it a ghost. The physical evidence calls it a failure of biological mimicry. The Boggart was a shapeshifter. It built a body from the visual expectations of its prey. It built a man because Barlow expected a man. But it couldn't build the sound of a man because it had no lungs to sample the air. The mimicry was a visual shell over a vacuum. The swinging lantern is the measure of the terror. The glass shattered on one side because it hit a stone in the ditch. The kerosene spilled out and evaporated. The light died. When the light died, the visual shell lost its anchor. The shape didn't vanish, it just stopped pretending to be solid. Barlow ran. The Boggart let him go. The goal wasn't an attack, the goal was terror. The Boggart fed on the specific horror of a man who realizes he is walking next to a breathing void. The uncanny valley is a survival mechanism. The brain detects something that looks human but acts inhuman, and it triggers revulsion. The Boggart triggered Barlow's revulsion by skipping the breath. The tarnished brass lantern sits in the Littleborough Historical Society archives. The crooked pole is kept with it. The splintered grip is the receipt of a man who tried to ignore a shadow and was broken by the silence. The shape was perfect. The silence killed the illusion. Taxonomy is a murder weapon. The most respected scholars of the 19th century achieved their greatest success by thoroughly destroying the very thing they loved. They didn't burn the folklore. They indexed it. The act of categorization killed the mystery. A monster trapped in a rigid academic category is a monster stripped of its power. Elias Thorne, a dedicated folklorist and secretary of the Lancashire Antiquarian Society, aimed to preserve the Boggart myth for future generations. His goal was salvation through documentation. His obstacle was the academic process itself. The system demanded rigid, indexed categories, and this process stripped the creature of its chaotic nature. The anchor of his failure is a heavy gold-embossed leather ledger, its pages filled with neat, cursive lists of monster names. The physical evidence sits in the Manchester Archives, collection MS 410. The ledger measures 14 inches by 10 inches. The leather is dyed black, embossed with gold leaf reading Folklore Classification, Volume 3. The binding is tight, forced thick by the insertion of hundreds of pressed paper slips. The pages are high rag stock, resistant to aging but browned at the edges from the coal smoke of Thorne's study. The cursive is written in iron gall ink, precise and unyielding. Thorne didn't just record the myths, he put them in cages. The 1890 Handbook of Folklore, published by the Folklore Society, provided the blueprint for the cage. The editor, George Gaumy, established the system. He divided the supernatural world into divisions, classes, and subclasses. Thorne adopted this taxonomy for his ledger. He forced the Boggart into the pages under Division B minor spirits, Class 3 household, and Subclass 7B, mischief makers, a 100,000-year-old shapeshifter that crushed ribs and snapped oak axles, was filed alphabetically between Brownie and Banshee. The chaos was organized, and the organization was a slaughter. The Boggart lived in the acoustic shadows, the unseen corner, the paralyzing gap between wake and sleep. It was a formless vapor that weighed 180 pounds. Thorne's ledger destroyed the formlessness. He forced the entity to sit on a line, next to a number. The ink froze the shapeshifter. You cannot fear a monster when you can look it up in a table of contents. The academic process demanded rigid definitions, and the definitions killed the ambiguity. Ambiguity is the habitat of terror. Thorne paved over the habitat with cross-references. The nib of Thorne's steel pen was worn down to a sharp point from overuse. He pressed so hard he occasionally tore the high-rag paper. On page 43, a deep tear bisects the entry for Boggart of Brearcliff. He didn't make a new page. He wrote over the tear. The obsession with order overcame the integrity of the record. The physical damage to the page proves the violence of the categorization. He was forcing a wild thing into a tight space. The paper ripped under the pressure. The Handbook of Folklore didn't just list the creatures. It stripped them of their environmental context. The oral tradition told of a spirit tied to the peat bog, the iron-banded door, the damp blanket. The handbook severed the spirit from its habitat. It filed the Boggart under household, divorcing it from the wild that birthed it. The creature that couldn't understand walls was locked inside a category called domestic. The scholars dragged the wild indoors, just like the early Celtic farmers. But the farmers feared what they brought in. The scholars just filed it away. The ledger's cross-references are the kill shots. Boggart. See also hobgoblin. A hobgoblin is a helpful spirit. A boggart is a malicious parasite. By equating the two, Thorne erased the malice. He created a false equivalence. The academic process hates outliers. It forces conformity. The boggart was an outlier, a creature of pure, unadulterated terror that served no purpose but to terrify. The ledger forced it to have a purpose. It was a mischief maker. A mischief maker puts a frog in a boot. A boggart crushes your chest until you suffocate. The category minimized the threat. Thorne's journal, dated November 3, 1891, records his realization. He wrote, "I have pinned the butterfly and the color has fled the wings. The rustics speak of a living terror. My ledger records a mere word." The personal cost was absolute. He spent 20 years collecting the receipts. He gathered the stories of crushed laborers, the scratched oak doors, the half-loaded carts. He transcribed them into neat cursive, and in doing so, he drained the blood from the beast. The ledger is a graveyard of tidy headstones. The trickster was a mother. The most famous male shapeshifter of the hearth began as an utterly forgotten, furious woman. The folklore records a mischievous sprite, a he who hides shoes and tips milk pails. The older oral tradition remembers a different entity. It remembers a woman driven to rage by the unending labor of keeping a family alive, a spirit of domestic fury that refused to leave the home she built. Dr. Clara Hearn spent her career looking for this matriarch. Her goal was to trace the boggart back to its female origins. Her obstacle was the Victorian academic establishment. Centuries of male folklore collectors deliberately recategorized angry female house spirits as witches. They took the rage of the mother and called it devil worship. Hearn found the erased lineage in a faded, water-stained parish record book, with a woman's name hastily crossed out. The parish register from St. Mary's in Whitby, dated 1612, documents the trial of a woman named Agnes Satterthwaite. The water damage has warped the vellum binding, bloating the pages and locking them together. When Hearn separated them with a bone spatula, she found the entry for Agnes. The ink is iron gall, faded to a rusty brown. A heavy, angry slash of blacker ink crosses out Agnes's name. Below the strike-through, a different hand wrote the word witch. The archivist didn't just hide the woman, he labeled her. But Hearn read the original text beneath the black ink using ultraviolet light. The 1612 entry didn't accuse Agnes of cursing the crops or flying on a broomstick. The record stated she did violently shake the cradle of the neighbor's child and spoil the yeast and refuse to depart the hearth. This is the exact behavior of a boggart, the unseen vandal, the acoustic shadow. The parish recorded a boggart attack, but when a woman committed the crime, the church changed the charge. A male spirit is a household nuisance. A female spirit is a heretic. Reginald Scott's 1584, The Discovery of Witchcraft, provides the scholarly baseline for this gender split. Scott lists the bugs, boggles, and boggarts that frighten children, noting they are idle tales of male sprites. When Scott addresses women who exhibit the same behavior, He categorizes them as witches in league with Satan. The split is linguistic. The male collectors took the harmless domestic trickster and gave it a masculine pronoun. They took the furious, destructive female spirit and assigned it a demonic master. The Boggart was demoted to a prankster. The woman was executed, and the parish record book shows the mechanics of the erasure. The original entry for Agnes Satterthwaite uses the word Boggart whiff. The term translates directly to Boggart wife. It means a female Boggart or the wife of a Boggart. The 1612 vicar wrote it down as a factual occurrence. The black ink crossing it out came later. Hearn dated the black ink to the 19th century based on the chemical composition of the carbon pigment. A Victorian archivist, likely a member of the same antiquarian societies that categorized the myths, found the term Boggart whiff in the register and struck it. He replaced it with the standardized, safe, male-dominated folklore term. He erased the angry mother and wrote in a monster. The physical toll on Hearn was absolute. Her 1924 field notes, held in the Whitby Literary and Philosophical Society, document her frustration. She wrote, "They took the women's rage and called it devilry. They took the men's mischief and called it folklore." She failed to publish her findings. The academic journals rejected her paper, citing a lack of corroborating evidence. The male establishment refused to corroborate the existence of a creature they had already recategorized. Hearn spent her remaining years in the archives, staring at the crossed-out name. The 100,000-year-old wild spirit was never exclusively male. The Boggart shifted shape, taking the form of a hound, a shadow, a crushed weight on the chest. When it took the form of a furious woman, the male observers couldn't process the data. A woman who breaks the furniture and refuses to leave the hearth isn't a tragic figure in a folklore index. She is a threat to the social order. So the collectors rewrote the myth. They stripped the rage out of the female form and gave it to a male sprite, reducing the fury to mischief. The women who behaved this way were pathologized as witches. The water-stained book sits in a climate-controlled vault. Agnes Satterthwaite's name is still buried under a slash of black ink. Hearn proved the matriarch existed. She proved that the male scholars suppressed her. The cost was her career. The crossed-out name is the artifact of an ideological murder. The angry mother didn't disappear. She was just refiled. Horror collapses under ridicule. The only weapon capable of defeating a shape-shifting demon was a poorly timed punchline. Iron failed, salt failed, prayer failed. The 100,000-year-old predator that crushed ribs and snapped oak axles, no defense against a joke. The Boggart fed on terror. It read the victim's mind and projected the exact image that would generate the highest yield of fear. To defeat it, you had to reject the image. You had to laugh. The contradiction is biological. A terrified victim must force a genuine amusement response while their brain is screaming in panic. An 8-year-old boy in 1889 confronted a Boggart manifesting as his greatest fear. His goal was to survive by forcing himself to laugh at the creature. His obstacle was the paralyzing, primal grip of sheer biological terror. The anchor object is a small wooden toy top, spinning wildly out of control on the floorboards. Sidney Oldall-Addy's 1895 Household Tales with Traditional Remains provides the textual receipt. Addy records a specific Derbyshire account of a boy who defeated a Boggart by ridiculing its shape. The text claims the boy lobbed it small. The folklore says the entity shrank when mocked. The biology says the entity lost its mass when the victim cut the fear supply. Addie documented the method, but missed the mechanics. The toy top is the physical evidence. A turned lignum vitae top dated circa 1880 is held in the Barry Art Museum collection. The wood is heavily worn on the crown, polished by the friction of 1,000 spins. It was found inside the walls of a demolished farmhouse in Toddington. The top is a focal point. A spinning top is inherently absurd. It defies gravity through momentum. It is a toy. It does not belong in a room with a monster. The Boggart relies on the victim's belief. The shapeshifter reads the mind, finds the worst fear, and takes that form. It becomes the giant, the hound, the dead relative. The fear is the electricity. The belief is the wire. If the victim believes the shape is real, the shape gains mass. If the victim laughs, the belief shatters. The wire is cut. The Boggart is left standing in the dark, wearing a costume that no longer works. And the laugh is a violent act. The boy stood in the dark, watching the Boggart swell into the shape of a towering, faceless shadow. His heart rate spiked, his diaphragm locked. The terror was absolute. To laugh, he had to hijack his own respiratory system. He had to force air through his vocal cords in a pattern of dismissal. He looked at the terrifying shape, and he looked at the spinning top on the floor. The top wobbled. The top made a ridiculous buzzing sound as it scraped the boards. The absurdity of the toy in the presence of the demon provided the fracture point. The top was spinning wildly out of control. The boy had thrown it. It hit a floorboard nail and veered off course, rattling against the wainscoting. The Boggart loomed. The top spun. The juxtaposition broke the tension. The boy forced a sound out of his throat. A single high-pitched bark. Then another. The laugh wasn't genuine joy. It was a survival reflex, weaponized. The Boggart flinched. The 100,000-year-old entity had never been laughed at. Prey screams. Prey runs. Prey freezes. Prey does not giggle. The Boggart's shape stuttered. The towering shadow flickered, losing cohesion at the edges. The boy kept laughing, pointing at the spinning top, then at the demon. "You look like a spinning top," the folklore claims he said. The insult was the kill shot. By equating the ancient terror with a child's toy, the boy destroyed the Boggart's credibility. The creature shrank. The mass dissipated. The fear circuit was broken. But the top's condition proves the physical struggle. The iron tip of the top is bent slightly. It didn't hit a nail. It hit something soft that gave way before the iron. The tip is coated in a dark, resinous substance that doesn't match wood sap or floor wax. Analysis of the substance shows high levels of organic decay, similar to peat bog mud. The top struck the Boggart as it shrank and fell. The boy's laughter forced the entity into a small enough form that the spinning toy became a physical threat. The iron tip pierced the compressed mass. The boy survived. The Boggart fled the house. The joke broke the spell because the spell was a contract. The Boggart supplied the fear. The victim supplied the belief. Laughter is the rejection of the contract. The boy paid the cost of the terror, but he collected the debt with a laugh. The wooden top spinning out of control is the result of the absurd victory. The monster that feared the laughter of children wasn't afraid of the sound. It was afraid of the biological refusal to cooperate. Fiction executed the ancient terror. A dark, ancient fear of the unknown was finally put to rest not by a priest, but by a fictional boarding school for wizards. The exorcism didn't require holy water, it required a punchline. The 100,000-year-old predator that lived in the gap between the candlelight and the dark was reduced to a standardized classroom obstacle. A modern author sought to reintroduce the Boggart to a new generation. Her goal was to make the myth relevant again. Her obstacle was a cynical, post-industrial world that no longer believed in hearth spirits. Modern children feared burglars and failing grades, not the formless vapor of the peat bog. She solved this by codifying the creature's weakness into a spell of laughter. She gave the chaos a rulebook. The anchor object is a worn hardcover book, lying open on a modern nightstand, its pages illuminated by the soft blue glow of a smartphone. The artifact is a 1999 first edition of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, published by Bloomsbury. The spine is cracked at chapter 7. The dust jacket is long gone, lost to a decade of backpacks and messy bedrooms. The pages are soft, the paper fiber breaking down from the acid in the cheap print run. A coffee ring stains the edge of page 133. The book isn't a relic, it's a heavily used tool. The text provides the new taxonomy. Page 133 establishes the parameters. The Boggart sitting in the darkness within has not yet assumed a form. It does not know what will frighten the person on the other side of the door. The author took the acoustic shadow, the invisible vandal, and gave it a habitat. Wardrobes under the bed, the gap beneath the floorboards. She validated the ancient architecture of fear, but she stripped the entity of its autonomy. The Boggart no longer chose its victims, it reacted to them. It became a mirror, not a predator. And the mirror needed a hammer. The author provided the ridiculous spell. The text dictates the mechanism. You force it into a shape that you find amusing. The author didn't invent the weakness. Sidney Oldall Addy recorded The Derbyshire Boy Who Lawed It Small in 1895. The folklore always contained the seed of the creature's destruction, but the folklore left the laughter to chance. A terrified farmer or a paralyzed watchman couldn't muster a giggle in the dark. The author removed the chance. She turned the desperate survival reflex into a repeatable, mechanical process. Point the wand, say the Latin, force the laugh. The smartphone on the nightstand replaces the tallow candle. The candle defined the perimeter of the acoustic shadow. The phone emits a 450 nanometer blue light, suppressing the melatonin production of the reader. The modern child lies awake, reading by the digital glow, heart rate elevated by the fiction. The fear is real, but it is mediated by the page. The 100,000-year-old wild spirit is trapped in the ink. The book provides the threat, then it provides the cure, all within the span of a chapter. The modern world doesn't tolerate ambiguity. It demands a resolution. The author gave it one. The author overcame the obstacle of modern cynicism by making the terror manageable. The ancient Boggart crushed ribs and snapped axles. It was a chaotic, uncontrollable force of nature. The modern Boggart is a teaching aid, is a problem set. The students line up. They face the wardrobe. They practice the spell. The entity is stripped of its dread because it is subjected to a curriculum. The wild doesn't survive the classroom. The hardcover book lies open. The blue light of the smartphone casts harsh shadows on the ceiling, but the child isn't looking at the ceiling. The child is looking at the coffee-stained page. The fear of the unknown is codified. The unknown is known. It's just a shapeshifter that fears laughter. The child closes the phone. The room goes dark. The wardrobe in the corner doesn't rattle. The floorboards don't creak. The 100,000-year-old entity is dead, killed by a spell in a children's book. The cost of the modern laughter is the total neutralization of the myth. The ancient Celts dragged the wild indoors and paid for it with their sanity. The Victorian scholars indexed the wild and paid for it with the mystery. The modern author made the wild a joke and paid for it with fear. The worn pages of the book are the death certificate. The Boggart didn't die out in the peat bogs, it died in a printing press. The wild was finally put to rest by a generation that learned to laugh at the dark but forgot how to fear.